Apologies to those who have been waiting for us. I'm Andrew Geddes, Director of the Migration Policy Centre at the European University Institute. Welcome to our third lockdown webinar. I can see from the chat on YouTube that there are a lot of people here, and it's great to see so many people joining us. Sorry we were a bit delayed. We had some issues around YouTube and Zoom. I'm sure we're all having to get used to these new realities, so hopefully you can forgive us for that. So this is the third in our lockdown webinars, and this time we're delighted to be working with our colleagues at EUI and the Global Citizenship Programme. And so it's a great programme of research also located in the Robert Schuman Centre at EUI, where the Migration Policy Centre is based. This is the third of our webinars, and today what we're going to look at is the effects of COVID-19 on mobility and citizenship. So for all of us, I suspect the immediate effects are very clear in terms of severe constraints on our personal mobility. What we want to do today is to understand not only what might happen in the future, but really to place those in the context of what is happening now and in a broader and wider context, to understand a lot more about the current developments in the wider context of mobility and citizenship globally in specific regions. And we have three presentations today and four speakers who are going to provide us with insights into these important questions. First of all, we have, well, I will introduce them to you briefly. First of all, we have a presentation from Jelena Dzankic and Lorenzo Piccoli. Jelena is a part-time professor in the Global Governance Programme at the EUI and co-director of GlobalCit. Lorenzo is a postdoc researcher at EUI and also in a Swiss NCCR program called On the Move, looking at mobility and citizenship in a project led from Neuchâtel. They're going to look generally at the effects of COVID-19 on citizenship. That will be followed by a presentation from Mehari Taddele Maru, who is a part-time professor in the Migration Policy Centre at EUI. And he's going to look at the effects of COVID-19 on mobility and citizenship in Africa. And the third presentation is by Leiza Brumat, who's a research fellow in the Migration Policy Centre, and she's going to look at the effects of COVID-19 and political responses in South America. So each presenter will speak for around 12 minutes or so. There'll be plenty of time for questions, but I do want to let you know that to ask questions, and many of you have already found it, as I can see from my phone, you need to use the chat function on our YouTube channel. That's basically the best way for us to manage questions. So please, if you have questions, put them into the chat function, and if possible, indicate the person or people to whom you are posing the question. That'll be really helpful, and I'll try to get through as many as I can. So thanks for joining us, and apologies for the delay once again, but I'd now like to hand it immediately over to Jelena and Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to speak at this webinar today. And as Andrew has mentioned, Lorenzo and I will talk about the effects of COVID-19 on citizenship. As everyone who's listening to this webinar knows, the rapid spread of the novel coronavirus has wrecked human mobility. It has disrupted the daily lives of billions of people worldwide. Its effects can be seen in policies including border closures, evacuations from the affected areas or spaces such as cruise ships, travel restrictions, but also confinement and quarantines. Further effects of COVID-19 can also be seen in social and behavioral practices, including and not limited to panic shopping of toilet paper, for instance, the alteration of greeting customs that entail physical contact, such as handshaking, hugging, etc., etc. All of these issues show how profoundly the virus has infected the relationship between citizenship as a guarantee of the state's responsibility for the well-being of the citizens on the one hand, and human rights and practices of solidarity on the other hand. So, ever since the World Health Organization back in March this year, declared that COVID-19 has become a global pandemic, we started to systematically monitor public decisions that regulate international movement in response to the outbreak of the novel coronavirus. Now, back then, our intuition was that states would be confronted with some sort of trade-offs. One such trade-off, and possibly the most important one, is the choice between prioritizing the safety of the state's own citizens, regardless of whether they lived within the state's territorial borders or not, or extending the protection to foreigners who are also long-term residents within those states. The former is, if you wish, a thick conception of membership, whether the latter is a thin one. Now, thinking about this trade-off, we've decided to break it down to three core questions. So in the context of pandemic, the first question that we ask is, whom do governments let in? The second one is, whom do they rescue? And the third one is, whom do they protect within the state's borders? Now, the different measures that the states have adopted to limit the spread of disease show how important the different notions of membership can become in the context of pandemic. Now, I'll hand over to my colleague Lorenzo, who will guide you through our original global data set of travel restrictions, which we use to discuss how public responses to the pandemic challenge our thinking about the meaning and purposes of citizenship.
Right, so to answer those questions, we use this data set, which is open access. We try to update it every day when we can, and we base the information on the online repository of the International Air Transfer Association, but we also double check with governments' websites and newspapers. Now, the first thing we can see using the data set is the quick rise in the number of countries that have introduced restrictions. This is not a surprise, of course, to you, but here we can see that at the beginning of March, there were 60 countries in the data set. The number went up to 160 already at the end of March, and now we are at 180 countries. So virtually the whole world has introduced some kind of travel ban. The second thing that we can observe using the data set is the diffusion of these restrictions globally. So first they started in the Middle East and in Asian countries. This is not a surprise. Again, Asia at the time was the center of the epidemic. Also, Asian countries had a previous experience with the viral outbreak, SARS, a few years ago, so they reacted very quickly. And then during the month of March, the restrictions spread to North American countries, Europe, South American countries, and only later on, at the end of March, at the beginning of April, they also started spreading in African countries. So this is one way in which we can use the data set. Now, the other way in which we can use it is to look at the exceptions. And this is helping us to answer the first question that was raised by Jelena. Who is it that governments let in? And here we see that citizens and residents are usually allowed to travel back to their country. This was a bit of a surprise for us. We were not expecting it, even though it is in line with international standards of human rights. In particular, we are thinking of Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The article says that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his or her own country. Now, what is surprising is that countries interpreted that article fairly broadly, so that one's own country is not only the country of citizenship, but it's also the country of residency. This points to a thinning of membership, of course. There are a few exceptions. For example, Malta introduced a deadline. I think the deadline was April 12 for everybody, citizens and residents, to travel back. The deadline was then interpreted flexibly, but still we see a different direction there. China introduced travel restrictions in early April and followed the principle of one flight per airline per week. So very few people were allowed to travel back to China. But these are exceptional cases. Now, of course, we all know that one thing is to have a right on paper, and quite another is to be able to use that right in practice. So here we have seen, following newspapers, that during the last few months, countries have mobilized very expensive resources. Think, for example, of medical assistance, consular assistance, and charter planes to bring back home their own nationals who were stranded abroad. Here you see a pretty lambastic slide from the External Action Service of the European Union. The United States, Israel, Australia also brought back many of their citizens and citizens only who were stuck in a foreign country. And here I couldn't resist, as Andrew mentioned, I'm working also for a Swiss project. I couldn't resist the temptation to use the picture of two Swiss nationals celebrating their return in Geneva airport in April. So this is clearly point to a thickening of membership based on a romanticized idea of citizenship, with governments trying to save, to rescue their nationals. Here again, there are a few exceptions. Jamaica, China, Romania, a few other governments actually asked their citizens who were abroad to stay abroad so that they wouldn't pose a risk traveling back to the country. But these are exceptions. And now I hand it over to Jelena again for an answer to the third question.
Thank you, Lorenzo. So finally, we can also observe radically different strategies that states employ towards foreign residents in the country and aspiring citizens. You may notice that many governments around the world, including but not limited to Australia, Denmark, Ireland, the Netherlands, the UK, the US, and also Vanuatu, has suspended citizenship ceremonies, thus temporarily freezing their citizenship bodies. Now, obviously, at the heart of these measures, there were public health concerns aimed at protecting the citizenry of these countries. However, they simultaneously put on hold people who were at the brink of naturalization. What we observe there is that states tend to concentrate their resources on those with permanent or multi-annual links to the territory. Just to give you a couple of examples, the Australian Prime Minister, for instance, invited all temporary residents and students to, in a way, go back to the country, to their own countries, because Australia had to focus on protecting its own citizens and permanent residents. Using the same rationale, but adopting a very different approach, Portugal extended citizenship rights to all migrants who had pending permit requests with the Portuguese border agency. So by doing so, Portugal allowed them to access healthcare and social security during the pandemic times. In this vein, we can also see the third development is that the UN is now also calling for a global action that would ensure that migrants and stateless persons receive protection regardless of their actual status in the country. Now, if you think about all of these developments, we would end this presentation with a short reflection on what citizenship means in this, if you wish, borderful world. And there we can think of two scenarios of whom governments protect within their borders. And essentially, these two scenarios are not mutually exclusive. So first, states may become more cautious towards whose safety they're responsible for. They may be less willing to grant passports to individuals with scarcely any connection to the state itself. And second, states may become more aware of and also open about the significance of migration for their economies. So on average, 13% of key workers in the European Union, including teaching professionals, skilled agricultural workers, care workers, cleaners, etc., are immigrants. We have seen in the last few weeks that travel bans have also resulted in the scarcity of seasonal and care workers across Europe. So in a way, awareness of the significance of migration would change not only policies, as has already happened with the case of the lifting of the travel ban for Romanian fruit pickers in the UK, but also a shift in the political discourse, a shift that would acknowledge that our societies thrive on and are not threatened by migration. Now, obviously, the counter trend of closed borders and excessively involved states might be more effective in curbing the pandemic. However, it could backfire by strengthening the grip of populist and authoritarian governments, increasing intolerance, xenophobia, and discrimination. And that would be a high price to pay if citizenship becomes too thick. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Lorenzo and Jelena, for that great overview. Obviously very difficult in a few minutes, but I think you've picked up some really powerful themes there that can help lead us into the next two presentations. The first of which will be by our colleague in the Migration Policy Center, Mehari Taddele Maru, who joins us from Addis Ababa. So I'm very happy to hand over to Mehari.
Thank you, Andrew, for the brief introduction. I'd like to start first by thanking my colleagues, if you can hear me, for organizing this meeting. And my main focus, the points that I would like to raise within the time limit, is to state a little bit on the state of COVID in the region, and also the general implication of COVID-19 in Africa. There are also specific implications for the mobility of people in the continent. Perhaps I will also touch upon the sustainability of these restrictions, given the pressure on economy, livelihoods, and so on. Just by way of, let me start with the numbers, a few numbers. As somebody, I think Lorenzo has highlighted, if we see the state of the pandemics in Africa, the number is not very large. It's only for now 30,000. And the days, however, is a bit higher. It's close to 5% of those who are confirmed cases. And recently, there is increasing local transmission. According to the African CDC, Center for Prevention, for Control and Prevention, it shows that there is about 54% of local transmission. And most of the restrictions that are being done or imposed are informed by previous pandemics, including, but not limited to, HIV/AIDS. And most of the transmission in Africa started later on, when the local transmission, actually the largest infection happens when the local transmission starts, and especially in slum area or informal areas in urban setting, and rural areas where you don't have health care system. So most of the restrictions on movement and so on are pegged, or the assumption is that healthcare system centered strategy of containment will not work because we don't have strong healthcare system. The main focus was more on controlling the vector, as they call it, human beings movement in the continent. And if I may, I want to share with you the kind of restrictions that are being taken now, if this is visible. Now, you will see that those countries in red are those who have total ban or closure of borders, including flights and so on and so on. And those in yellow, most of them have partial restrictions of different kind, including international, but also internal travel bans that they have. The others on yellow are with very, very limited restrictions that are imposed and imposed nationally, not necessarily within the specific context of internal movement within the country. So the restriction on mobility could be seen in 4 areas. 1, total or partial border closure, including internal and external borders. So there are many countries who have imposed internal movement also from different locations. The second one is, of course, road and aviation connections between countries, including within Africa, but beyond Africa, or from and to Africa. There are also thousands of stranded travelers and migrants still wanting to return to African countries within Africa and different African countries, but also outside African countries. And you have also deportation of African migrants, even those who are legal residents in different parts of the world, especially in the Middle Eastern countries. So they are being deported without really proper preparation for quarantine of significant number of migrants. And so you have several impact in this regard. We know that the kind of measures, the restrictions, like I mentioned earlier, include curfews, also state of emergency, flight bans, travel bans, even limited number of movements of goods and trade between countries. And some of the, of course, measures, the most known measures are, we know the issue of social distancing, hygiene, healthcare system in terms of testing, treating, and hospitalization. And in our context, these are becoming difficult, especially to migrants, refugees, IDPs, where you have camp life, congestions, access to hygiene and water is limited, livelihood are being affected because the informal economy takes huge, significant part of the economy. And in cross-border areas, traditional cross-border movements of pastoralists are also significantly hampered, especially pastoralists move for grazing and watering, water wells and for their pasture, for their cattle during evening, and some of the countries in their border areas have imposed curfew of movement. And the impact is huge because they cannot tend to their cattle, but also sell their cattle in markets because of these limitations. Now, so there are pre-existing conditions, let me use that word, that even exacerbate the situation on free movement and mobility within African countries. We know the barriers, the political barrier, history, security, trust among countries. Trust is deteriorating even further in border areas. And you have also physical barriers, the absence of infrastructures to make sure testing and processing, for example, vehicles, and also trucks that are moving even essential goods to the market, that usually border areas that take 20 minutes or 1 minute, 1 hour would take a long time for processing. Immigration officials are not well equipped, so the tendency, propensity is to totally close those border areas. On top of that, of course, there are issues of corruption and bureaucracy that affect this movement. Now, the African Union and regional economic communities has been trying to coordinate responses, lobbying in the international landscape for more assistance, information sharing among member countries, and in cross-border areas also facilitating. But they are yet, and also they were involved in several research, but they are yet to bring any effect on the ground as such. They are just on the process. Most of the responses are member states-led responses. And until now, the regional and continental African Union and regional economic communities are just trying to guide the responses at continental and regional level only. governors and mayors have also taken significant role in that regard, especially in making sure that the movement of people is accordingly managed. Now, in most of the countries, if you wish also, we have other kind of impacts in addition to mobility, but they have significant impact also on the movement of persons indirectly. Like I mentioned, the socioeconomic impact is huge. The political and governance impact on politics and governance is significant. Many countries are now postponing elections, for example, citing that mobility of their election officials, a significant number of election officials, for example, in Ethiopian case, about 220,000 or more election officials will be hampered. And due to that, election boards or authorities suspending indefinitely elections. And this is not unique, and some are considering this one as power grab through using the pandemics as pretext. The movement of healthcare workers and also is also limited significantly. In urban areas, large informal settlements and informal economy, sections of informal economy are unable to perform well because of the restrictions on free movement or movement of people. And some would consider that it is better. They are forced to choose between, if you wish, the way they use it, death by corona or death by hunger, if you wish, in significant portions of this informal settlement and so on. So increasing pressure on the sustainability of the restrictions on movement, especially in border areas. Like I said, they are extremely dependent on the movement of their cattle and so on. Now, significant impact of these restrictions also is felt on women, especially in border areas, but in the informal sector, where 3/4 of the informal cross-border trade and informal economy is actually run by women, if you wish. So that has significant impact on families which are headed by women and also generally as a member of families. There is also impact on tourism. Of course, tourism is essentially about movement, and many countries are dependent on tourism. The impact on remittances has been also highlighted repeatedly in different research outputs and also media reports. Earlier, I mentioned the impact on governance and politics, on the right to vote and to elect, run for office, which is related to movement of various actors, including politicians, election officials, and so on. With this, also the capacity of member states to collect revenue is affected. In some countries, they are also highlighting that impact. In addition to the additional expense on healthcare, it will stretch the capacity of countries to respond to this to the pandemics effectively. Now, last, I would like to raise on the sustainability of the measures. There is huge pressure on governments to reconsider or at least introduce pragmatic hotspot-based restrictions on it. That it should not be blanket all over the country, because some countries have been waiting for some sort of peak in terms of infection, but when they don't see it to happen immediately, the assumption is that the pressure is increasing on governments to loosen up a little bit on the restrictions. There are many modeling that are being conducted, which is very difficult to peg any measure on those models, and it's looking like waiting for Godot, basically, on how to all the measures that will be taken on the progression that is made by the virus, spread of virus in the continent. So that is serious challenge, if you wish, in terms of the sustainability of the measures. Secondly, on border areas now, there is a little bit of lessening of restrictions, especially in the countries where all the blocks that have free movement arrangements. For example, the East African community has allowed, even if in a small number and slowly, have allowed the movement of goods and to an extent a little bit of service in the healthcare between countries. But still, they are pressured in terms of the queue that is in these border areas. I finish here, and later on, maybe in the question and answer session, I will bring some few points later. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Mehari. That was fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And just to remind everybody that if you want to ask questions, please put them into the chat function on the YouTube channel. We have some questions already and we'll do our best to get through them. So I'd like now to hand over to my colleague in the MPC, Leiza Brumat, who's going to be talking about the situation in South America. So please, Leiza.
Well, let me share my screen with you. Yeah, here we are. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar. I will talk about the policy responses. Let's see if I can, for some reason, sorry, there we go. Now I can change. Well, about the policy responses that some countries in the Global South have been adopting in face of the COVID-19 crisis. Well, Mehari and I joined forces and we wanted to provide you with a bit of a Global South perspective on this. As we all know, the pandemic hit first countries in Global North, and countries have been looking at each other to see how to handle with this unprecedented situation. And we will try to see whether the measures adopted in these countries in the Global South have resembled or not the ones in the Global North. So I will focus specifically on South America. Why South America and not Latin America, as we commonly hear everywhere? Well, for several reasons. South America has its own political dynamics, but particularly South America is a region of intra-regional migration. I mean, most of human mobility in South America happens within South America, unlike what happens with Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, which are regions mainly of emigration towards the United States. So I would like to begin first by telling you a bit about the context in which the COVID-19 crisis started in South America. It hit South America at a very bad time. Now, we all seem to have forgotten that these things were happening a few months ago, but a few months ago, there were social protests in almost all of South American countries, the epicenter in Chile. There is an ongoing which led to the largest forced migration flows in the history of South America, with more than 5 million people leaving Venezuela in the last 4 or 5 years. There is also an ongoing economic crisis and economic slowdown in almost all of the region, but particularly in the 2 largest economies, Argentina and Brazil. And at the same time, these countries are dealing with their own epidemics, like dengue fever, for example, or malaria in Venezuela. So what I want to say by this is that all these problems are still there. They will very likely worsen because of this situation, and they have also determined the political responses that countries have adopted towards the COVID-19 crisis. I will address these political responses in 3 levels. So these responses have differed quite a lot among 3 levels: the regional, the national, and the sub-regional local levels. At the regional levels, countries have tried to coordinate regional positions, particularly for border closures. So at the presidential level, presidents have been in contact to coordinate border closures. All the borders in South America right now are closed and movement is quite limited. Mercosur, which is the most developed regional integration process in the region, has adopted the Common Fund to promote research on COVID-19 and to increase state capacities for testing. And there are some very interesting cases of bilateral coordination. For instance, the border between Brazil and Uruguay is a border that is very interactive, let's say, and there are some urban spaces that are not clearly national, binational. Oh, sorry, I changed it. Okay, there we go. Okay, there are not really, there's no real border. So there are some common binational spaces, binational urban spaces where people interact and go back and forth between the two countries on a daily basis. In this type of urban areas, countries have coordinated positions and have decided not to take controls in those non-existent borders, but outside these common urban spaces. Another important point in terms of regional cooperation is a vacuum that was left by UNASUR. UNASUR used to be a regional organization that mostly focused on political cooperation, but the interesting thing of UNASUR was that it was quite successful in promoting common health policies and promoting common positions in the area of health, common South American positions in the area of health. And UNASUR had created some institutions for joint research at the regional level to deal with the specific needs of the region. UNASUR was basically abandoned by most of its members in the last 2 years, and it's basically not working right now at a moment in which it would be much needed. Then, going to the national level. Well, as you can see in that little map that resembles quite a lot with all the colors, the African map, the policy responses have been quite heterogeneous. And this heterogeneity can go from very voluntary-based responses to a very strict enforcement of immobility. For instance, Uruguay is enforcing voluntary quarantine, as is Brazil, at least at the national level, but at the same time, the discourses that have been adopted are quite different between themselves. So Argentina and Uruguay are endorsing a discourse at the national level that is very much based on a society approach, a humanitarian approach about endorsing multilateralism, while countries like Brazil have adopted a kind of, the president, a kind of Trump approach. We have to privilege the economy kind of approach to the lockdown and not doing a lockdown. While at the same time, there are other countries that have enforced regimes by which they are currently militarizing the borders, some streets, and even not letting their own nationals into their own countries. For instance, Bolivia. There are some Chile and Bolivia and not being able to enter their own country. And also, Chile and Bolivia have suspended national elections. At the sub-regional local level, we can see even more heterogeneity. What happens at the sub-regional local level sometimes can be very contradictory to the measures taken by the national government. There are, in some cases, closed borders within the countries, inside the country. So they're at the border between one province and the other. And we have to take into account that we are talking about some countries that have very vast territories. So this means that people are trying to go back to their houses and maybe traveling for 10 or 15 hours and then getting stuck at an internal border and having to find themselves somewhere to sleep or sleeping into a car or something like that because they're not able to travel back. The very interesting case is a Chilean case because Chile is enforcing a municipality-based lockdown. This leads to situations in which, for instance, inside Santiago de Chile, there are some neighborhoods that are under a very strict quarantine and people can go out of their houses only twice a week with a very strict permit, and maybe 5 streets away, there is another neighborhood where there is no quarantine. But the most paradigmatic case of opposition between the local level and the national level is Brazil, where there are some governments of some states that are openly opposing the policies adopted by the president, particularly the richest states of Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, which are enforcing their own lockdowns. And then going to the very, very, very local level, we can see that there are the most vulnerable neighborhoods like favelas or slums in many countries, not only in Brazil, but also in Argentina, are getting self-organized and are organizing their own type of quarantine. And as for many people who live in this type of area, staying in your house is just not an option. They are trying to adopt and to promote campaigns such as stay in your neighborhood. And it is the same vulnerability of a large part of the population. Well, I guess that many of you know that more than 50% of the workforce in South America works in the informal market. Many of these people have already lost their jobs and find themselves many times in a very difficult situation by which a lot of them, and this affects many migrants, but internal migrants as well, cannot afford to stay in the place where they are in at the moment, cannot afford to pay for their rents, cannot have access to basic needs, and they are thinking about returning. So the current crisis is dealing to, paradoxically, more mobility, another type of mobility. Right now, what's going on is a wave small of return migration. There are some people who are going back to Venezuela, which is very dangerous at the moment for a very large number of reasons. And there is also a phenomenon of urban to rural migration. This means that there are people that can no longer afford to stay in their big cities. So let's say, for instance, this is happening in Lima, and people are leaving Lima to go back to their houses in rural areas, which increases mobility. Then some countries, how are some countries trying to deal with many of these situations? Well, few countries are given access to migrants to the subsidies that they are adopting for the most vulnerable situation, for the most vulnerable population. For instance, Argentina and Brazil. But this depends on the residence of the migrants. In this regard, the regional programs to give residence to migrants are proving to be quite important for the survival of many of the mobile population within South America. So finally, to sum up, can we see that there is a South American response to this? Well, not really. We have to look at the different levels. At the regional level, there are quite limited responses and some coordination, particularly at the borders. There are restrictions to mobility. All the countries have adopted some kind of physical or social distancing measures, but they differ quite a lot, depending on the level that we talk about: national, subnational, local. Some countries have even militarized their streets and their borders to enforcing mobility, even adopting curfews, which means that there is complete immobility, particularly at night. For instance, in Chile, in Ecuador, and in Peru. Now, this has paradoxically led to more mobility and a new flow of return migration, both at the national and subnational levels. So finally, our policy responses, can we say that policy responses are that different from the countries that were first hit by the pandemic? Well, we are talking about a region where for large parts of the population, immobility is just not a feasible option. So of course that countries are looking at what's happening in other countries, particularly the north, but of course getting adapted to local capabilities and resources. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Leiza. That was great. Thanks very much. As I say, if you've got questions, please send them through the chat function you'll see on the YouTube page that we're using for this. So now I'll turn to the questions, and we've had a lot of questions come in, and I'll do my best to get through as many as I can. Apologies if I don't get to everybody, but as I said, I'll do my best. And if the responses could also be relatively brief, that will help me get through as many as possible. So first, some questions for Lorenzo and Jelena. The first is from Emilian Fargs, who asks whether states allowed only long-term residents to come back or also short-term residents, were any distinctions made. Then Lamin Abad asks, is it legal for countries to have different rules for nationals and long-term residents? What will be the justification for that? I think that's again a question for Lorenzo and Jelena. And then there's a question from Andrea, who asks asking Jelena and Lorenzo if they know of any countries that extended protections to irregular migrants residing within their borders. And then Victoria Finn a question for Jelena and Lorenzo, and asked if you could comment on the let back in and rescue aspects regarding dual citizens as compared to nationals and long-term residents. So those are some questions for Lorenzo and Jelena. I've got some questions now for Mehari, if you'll just bear with me while I scroll down my phone to get to them. So the first question is from Cherkos, who asks about the situation in Ethiopia and asks if the government is using the coronavirus to postpone a national election. Asks for Mehari's opinion on that. Then we have a question from who ask, would you attribute the failure of some countries, especially in Africa, from repatriating their citizens to scarce resources, or was it a kind of politicization of the issues? That's a question from Aziz. And a question from Taddele to Mehari, asks why the Ethiopian government is pushing Eritrean refugees to change their current asylum centres amid this pandemic. So those are some questions for Mehari, and then some questions which have come in for Leiza. So again, if you'll bear with me, I will get to those questions. So a question from Ashley, who asked how much the crisis has consolidated the power in the hands of non-state actors, or what Ashley calls illegitimate actors in South America. And a question has arrived from Oleg Korniev, former colleague of mine. So nice that Oleg's joined us. A comment to Leiza asking about the contestation of national level measures. And he comments that this also happens at the municipal level in Ukraine. Perhaps Oleg's drawing out a comparative point there, where it seems to be a way, as he puts it, to attract voices in forthcoming local elections. And Nuria asks about, from a gender perspective, and asks about maybe put.
Oleg, question a bit, because you got frozen at the moment and I lost you.
All right, sorry, I'll repeat that. Oleg is drawing out a comparative point about the situation in Ukraine, whereas he puts it, the kind of the local politicization of measures can be used as a way to attract votes in local elections. And then we got a question on the gender perspective from Nuria, which I put to you, Leiza. Evidence, from your knowledge of South America, on intra-family violence increasing and the situation for women and girls as a result of the election. So there's quite a lot of questions. So I'll begin with Jelena and Lorenzo. They've got some questions, maybe want to split them, then go to Mehari, then go to Leiza. But if you could be brief in your responses, please, that'd be much appreciated. Thank you. Jelena?
Thank you very much, Andrew. So thank you to Emilian, Lamin, Andrea, and Vicky for the questions. I'll take Emilian's and Vicky's question and respond to them as they're very much related, and Lorenzo will deal with the other two questions. So essentially what we can see, and this is something that Lorenzo and I will seek to explore in the future, is that, and Emilian's question was whether states allowed long-term residents or also short-term residents to return, and whether there have been any distinctions. Whereas Vicky asked about the differentiation between let individuals back in versus rescue them in cases they're dual nationals. So what we can see is that most of the countries around the world have let their nationals back in. So they did not differentiate there. And this goes back to Vicky's question. Yet when it came to extending the protection in terms of rescuing the issue of dual nationals came up quite a few times. At the very onset of the epidemic, and this is something that you can consult our first blog about, essentially countries had problems rescuing their dual nationals from China. And sometimes the reason was that countries did not have competence over these nationals if they entered China on a Chinese passport. So I think that this is where we can see a very much of a difference in terms of whether an individual has or does not have dual nationality. We can see that also Belgian and French citizens in Morocco are facing very similar issues at the moment. Now, when it comes to long-term residents, many countries, and you can check our database for a detailed overview, allow long-term residents to re-enter the country. The issue is different when it comes to evacuation and rescue operations, because normally these are extended to long-term residents only in exceptional circumstances. And finally, when it comes to short-term residents, we can see a plethora of approaches across the different countries. So we can see for short-term residents that have happened to be inside a country in a given moment, the host countries had very different approaches, starting from the approach of Australia that I talked about. So essentially inviting temporary and short-term residents to go back home, to the approach of Portugal, which essentially extended some sort of protection to temporary residents. Many home countries decided to repatriate their nationals who are abroad for very short periods of time. So there you can also see the differences between countries of origin and countries of destination. And finally, if you think about short-term residents who happened to be outside of their host country, when travel restrictions have been introduced, we can see also very different approaches. Quite a lot of countries have decided to cancel certain categories of visas, essentially not allowing short-term residents to enter those countries. In other states, this was possible, but there's a plethora of approaches to this issue. And I think that in our future work, Lorenzo and I will try to systematically approach them, looking at the information that's contained in our database. So now I hand over to Lorenzo for the other two questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to keep it very short. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure, and I cannot answer your question on whether it is legal to ban the return of residents and citizens, but indeed we saw a few countries doing it. Fiji, for example, put a blank ban on everybody. And I think from our perspective, it's also very interesting to see that most of the countries attach additional complications for certain categories of people. So to give you an example, in Indonesia, residents are allowed to return, but unlike citizens, they have to provide a healthcare certificate that is written in English, and it is backdated 1 week earlier. So this makes it very complicated in some cases. And my perspective of a political scientist is that countries are unlikely to impose a ban on residents to return, but many of them are making it very complicated to exercise that right in practice. There was the other question by Andrea on irregular migrants. That's a very topical question in Italy. That's at the center of the political debate since a few days. I'm not aware of any country explicitly expanding the protection, the healthcare protection to undocumented migrants. Here we know that provisions change significantly already from one country to the other. It is possible that subnational administrations, local and regional actors have taken actions in this direction. But we are not aware of that. So if you are, please get in touch with us. And on our data set, you can also see restrictions for other categories. I'm mentioning this because I saw it popping up in the chat on YouTube. such as seasonal workers and family members of citizens and residents. Those exceptions are indeed very rare. About 15 countries grant those exceptions. But again, if you go on the data set yourself, you can see which ones have already introduced those exceptions. And what we see is that this is very much a work in progress also for governments. Exceptions are being added week after week. Some of them are being taken away because this is all part of political debates that are evolving. So we hope we will continue to work on this for the future, of course.
So could I just check that Mehari did, I mean, just a question for Mehari. Did you actually get the questions, Mehari? Your microphone is muted.
Only one of the questions I got with regard to Eritrean refugees.
There's another question as well. So there's a question about Eritrean refugees. And could I also add, there's a question from Chairkos, who asked whether the government is using the coronavirus to postpone national elections in Ethiopia. Your opinion on that?
Yes.
And there was also a question from Aziz, which I will try to find if you can. Yes, and Aziz asks about the issue of repatriation in Africa, and I suppose it's a question about state capacity, which well, some of the measures have been introduced. So those, if you could address those. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So over to you, Barry.
Thank you. Now, the first one on Eritrean refugees. I think first, let me state that Ethiopian refugee policy is out of the camp policy. It follows out of the camp policy, and refugees with a certain requirement can live outside the camp. But there are still several camps with a total number of 900,000 refugees in Ethiopia currently. And most of them are from South Sudan, Somalia, and Eritrea. One of the camps, recently, there was pronouncement by the government to close the camp. Until now, UNHCR have requested for clarification, and many others, including myself, has been asking for that, but nothing has come out of the government. So people are forced to speculate the reason behind the closure of one of the camp and moving the refugees to another congested camp. So if you move during Corona, when the main requirement is physical distancing, and you move significant number of refugees to another refugee camp, which is already congested, you are creating a physical, the government is creating a physical jamming, if you wish, of the refugees in one camp. Because already the camps that we have are short of water, hygiene, and also other necessary provisions that could help mitigate the propagation of the virus in those kind of camp life. And apparently the camp that is planned to be closed is a well-planned. It has been there for a long time. People are used, and it's better established than others. But it is exactly on the border between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And recently, the federal government, since 2 years ago, has reached an agreement of peacemaking with Eritrea, and there seems to be a political justification for closing that one. But we know on refugee status, cessation of status of refugee happens only on specific conditions, which has to go back to the reason why, if there is well-founded reasons or cause or grounds for persecution. And until now, there is no cessation clause that was basically applied. And without that, the problem is still there. And no one knows why this is happening. It looks like more of political than operational or refugee protection related movement. And the movement should not have happened during this pandemic. The second question on the impact of Corona on politics, I think it is almost clear that the pandemic creates one dilemma always, a trade-off between public health, which is an important duty of the state and non-state actors. On the other hand, the trade-off with rights and freedoms, which are also important to be protected and respected. Now, one of the rights that is being affected is free movement right or freedom of movement. And with that, you have significant implications for election, for voting to be elected, campaigning, movement of materials, and so on and so on. For that reason, some countries have imposed state of emergency. Ethiopia apparently is in the partial lockdown situation, but it has declared state of emergency. And with state of emergency, the chance for limiting or derogation of rights, freedoms is higher. And in an impact on this is on the conduct of election. But many dispute that whether this applies to all areas and whether how long should be waited for this election to happen is not clear. So there are many questions on epidemiological level and also actual issues of implementation, whether there are alternatives. And this is not unique to Africa. Look at Bolivia, look at Chile, and so on, that they are trying to use it. In Europe also, there are elements of Corona power grab, if you want to call it. And that is a challenge that we are facing. In Ethiopian case, it has led to sort of constitutional crisis, at least debate. I don't call it crisis, it's clear. Then that is a challenge that we see, and it may continue. The violations of human rights of other kinds because of curfew is happening. There are several killings that has happened in Africa because of the measures taken on Corona and the excessive force being used by many enforcement agencies. Now, there was another question on repatriation, the capacity of countries, and ultimately, in my opinion, the idea of countries who have higher capacity of delivery of public goods, public service, including health and other kind of checks, for example, subsidies, are doing better than others. It's not only popular legitimacy in the form of democracy, which is important. Actually, some of the democracy are not doing compared to others who are less democracy in terms of responding to this. So the delivery capacity or capability for delivery of public goods and capability for running also democratic elections and democracy are becoming a critical issue that will have impact on the governance in general. So countries who are not able, for example, to bring their citizens, some have tried, and they are still organizing repatriation of their nationals. But in the most acute and difficult one is actually deportation happening from Middle Eastern countries. And there are history of deportation, and the nature of the state of those who are deporting are not constrained by any kind of accountability. And there is no leverage to influence them as you would expect in other countries. Thank you. I think these are the main questions. If there are any other, I will try to address them later.
Thank you very much, Mehari. We are running a little short of time, but I just wanted to know, I think Leiza, I've got another couple of questions that came in because I think you spoke third and people asked questions came in sort of immediately afterwards while others were responding to questions. So there's a question which is from Luca Marano, who asked about the effects in Chile of the pandemic on social mobilization in Chile, from Luca Marano. And Maria Torres asked about the political costs that Bolsonaro will have in Brazil due to his controversial way of handling the epidemic. So those are additional questions about Chile and Brazil. I think these are very, and then, so if you could respond briefly, we might be able to squeeze in a few more questions as well.
Okay.
Thanks, Leiza.
Thank you very much for your questions. I will try to be very brief because I could talk about this for hours. About the role of non-state actors, well, I don't remember the name of the person who referred to it, but I think she talked about illegitimate state actors. Well, all the non-state actors, they say legitimate or not, I think you're talking about the narcos. There were some news about the narcos in the favelas enforcing quarantines. Well, yeah, in the areas where the state is not present right now, or has less present, yeah, the role of both the legitimate civil society organizations and the non-legitimate ones is getting reinforced, adopting their own type of policy for their specific locations. Then Oleg, thank you very much for joining us. About Ukraine and the comparative national level measures. Yes, there is. Well, I can give you, for example, the example of my hometown, Buenos Aires, where the government of the city is of the political party of the opposition of the national government. So they are trying, at the beginning, they coordinated some measures, but then they took some other particular different measures non-coordinated with the national government, which could be a way of showing political differences. But we also have to take into account that local, subnational, and regional and national measures, and sometimes the differences in many of these countries have to do with the difference in the resources. There are some cities and some neighborhoods in these cities that are much richer and have many more health capacities and welfare capacities than others that may be very close to them. And then also on the federalism system on many of these countries. In this regard, Brazil is a very important case of a very federal country. Then about women and girls, Nuria, if you want to write to me, I can recommend you some very good work on women and girls, because there are people who are doing amazing things on that specific topic. But I can tell you in general terms that as women are usually in charge of domestic tasks, their situation is quite vulnerable and precarious right now, particularly of regional migrants, and especially these groups that I talked about, the ones that are trying or looking or have to return to the places of origin. These people find themselves in a situation in which they have to choose whether to stay or to go, because they don't have basic access, especially to health services. Pregnant women especially are left without access to health services in many cases, and they have to take the desperate decision of going back. But there are many specific work on this, and I can send it to you if you want to write to me. Then the effects in Chile. Well, Chile is not in a national lockdown. It depends on the municipalities, but this has particularly the effects of the COVID on the social protests has been of stopping them. So right now they are paused because people cannot really manifest. There were some manifestations for Workers' Day on the 1st of May, but right now the social protests, for obvious reasons, cannot go on. Briefly, and the political costs for Bolsonaro. Well, Bolsonaro is right now undergoing a very special situation in which he's getting increasingly isolated in the countries. Most of the governors of all the states are opposing his policies. He has most of the National Congress against him. Many of his ministers oppose his positions, but he crucially still has the support of many crucial actors, like some evangelist churches, some economic sectors, and parts of the military. So there is currently a power struggle going on in Brazil. We will see.
Great, many thanks, Leiza. So we have time just for one final round of questions. I'm afraid time is a bit short. So I'll just, the first question, I will find it on my phone. Well, apologies while I just scroll to it. It's from Joachim Jarro. It's for Jelena and Lorenzo. This is a yes/no question. Are restrictions or exceptions for temporary seasonal workers also recorded in your data set? So that one you can address fairly quickly, I hope. And then we also have put a question to you, which is coming from Ruvi Ziegler, who been legal or other challenges to restrictions on movement of spouses or partners, and also as aware of 20+ countries that recognise that for. That's a question from Ruvi Ziegler. For Mehari, again, we do have a lot of questions, so I really apologise if I'm not getting to your question. I'm very sorry. I'm doing my best to try and get as many as we can. A question for Mehari from Dzankic, which I think is, he talks about the situation in Ghana, but I think has a wider resonance across Africa, about people in rural communities due to lockdown in cities, which has increased rural-urban movement, and ask whether you foresee more people moving to rural communities as a result of COVID-19. A question for Leiza, sorry, as while I scroll down. Irena Landini asks Leiza if you think the impact of COVID-19 on migration trends are permanent or temporary. Will people who return to home countries or to rural areas go back to cities and host countries? That's a big question from Irena. Many thanks for that. And about that will have to be the last question. I'm really sorry, there's some great questions come in, but it's not possible to get to all of them. So first I'll go to Jelena, if that's okay. Start with you, if you want to mute.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So we currently do not have restrictions for seasonal and temporary workers in the data set. However, we are planning to expand it and complement it in the coming months. So I hope that with the passing of the time, we will essentially be able to include it. If you go and look at our presentation and also at the database, you will see all other exceptions that we include in the database. Thank you.
Andrew, you're muted. I don't know if you want me to.
Yes, please. If you could
add something to that. So since the question was a yes or no, our answer is yes and no, because you can indirectly understand which countries grant exceptions by looking at exceptions based on work and business reasons, and also based on long-term visa. So that's, of course, a proxy for seasonal workers for us. And Ruvi's question, I don't know about legal challenges. That is something we would have to look up. Of course, that's not part of the data set per se. The countries that tend to grant exceptions for family members, either of nationals or of residents, are mostly in Europe and then some Asian countries. There are not many. As I said, I think there are at the moment 22 countries in total that grant those exceptions. We keep referring to the data set that you can explore yourself. You might have no clue of where to access it. Simply go on globalcit.eu and you will find the link there.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Leiza? Oh, no, sorry, Mehari. Sorry, Mehari first. Sorry. Yeah, I'm getting my order wrong. Sorry, Mehari.
Thank you, Andrew. I have only one question, that on the issue of urban-rural movement, it's very difficult to call it migration in the sense of established trend, in my opinion. I think it happened in some countries, including Kenya and others, where in the beginning, the assumption was that COVID is of urban disease, and also it is for, if you wish, even equalizer and so on and so on. I think that kind of thinking now is not anymore going to influence significantly decisions of people to move to a rural area. Already, like I said, local transmission is starting. Some of the confirmed cases now we have, Ethiopia or other countries, including South Africa, others, Kenya, are not limited only to the urban areas. There are elements and reports from rural areas. So I very much doubt that there will be a trend that will set for a long time of movement from urban to rural area. Like also, I think if we also take from the previous experiences of pandemics, HIV, AIDS, and so on, which are very important prism through which we can look and learn to some extent, even if it's not exactly the same, is that those kind of transmissions start later on in the rural area. Interconnectedness, mobility, and so on are limited, or aviation or other kind of movements. And it's for that reason, and if you see the highly hit countries are those who have high mobility in the beginning, international mobility, a lot of flights, tourism, and others. Now, I think that trend is changing. I don't believe there will be a long-term trend of urban-rural migration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehari. And so, Leiza.
Okay, Irene, thank you very much for your question. We don't really know the answer. It depends. It depends on how the lockdown and the quarantine measures proceed and how long they last, but particularly on the economic effects of this. I don't think that return migration to Venezuela is something quite sustainable in long terms, because the reasons why migrants left Venezuela are still there and they're still getting worse. So I do not think that at least emigration to Venezuela is very sustainable in the long term, but that's yet to be seen.
I'm afraid that brings the seminar to a conclusion. I'd like to thank everybody who's participated in today's session, the speakers, so Jelena, Lorenzo, Mehari, Leiza for their talks, and also everybody who's joined us. We've had a great audience today, many, many fantastic questions, and I really apologise for not being able to get to them all. So please do keep in touch with us at the Migration Policy Centre, and also keep in touch with the great work done by the GlobalCit project, all of which is available via the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies here at the EUI. There will be more lockdown, partially unlocked, but not enough to do physical reach a much wider audience. So we will carry on making sure that our seminars are also webinars in the future as well. I'm sorry there was a slight technical difficulty at the start, but I'd like to thank the tech staff we have here who did a great job in getting everything working properly for us. And so we'll leave it there for today. And so please keep in touch with us, and we'll see you next time, hopefully. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.